Well, yeah. Okay, Mel. So I think we're going to start. Good evening, everyone. Here's André Schmidt. I am the current editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Journal of Anesthesiology. First, I would like to welcome the audience to the first webinar organized by the Brazilian Journal in 2023. It's really a great honor to meet you all at this special event. As you know, in addition to review scientific manuscripts and conduct the editorial process of our journal, our editorial office and our associate editors are working hard to produce new material that can enhance the connection between readers, clinicians, and researchers that are responsible for publications in our journal. With that in mind, we are regularly producing some material to our social media platforms when we can share some of our main findings, main publications in our journal. And also we are regularly producing some podcasts that are really interesting and very frequently accessed by our readers all around the world. More recently, we are producing some brief videos that videos containing the information provided by authors, discussion by authors on their own findings, and commenting about their manuscripts. And of course, webinars. Since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, we started to organize monthly webinars, especially dedicated to discuss some relevant topics in science and about the editorial process in general. Today, we are going to have a very special meeting. This is the third international meeting since the beginning of these activities in 2020. And in this meeting, we will have the presence of Ben William Mall, professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and gynecology at Monash University. The title of this webinar is "We Finally Have the Data, but are they really true? Addressing fraud in scientific research." This is an extremely relevant topic that we need to discuss in a deeper way. And it's a great opportunity today to have a specialist very relevant in the field to discuss and teach us how to detect, how to analyze the data in a proper way, and how to detect researchers that are not following the correct way to do science. I would like to read a couple of words about the main background of our speaker. Professor Ben concentrates on the organization of multi-centric evaluative research in obstetrics, gynecology, and fertility. His research focuses mainly upon everyday practice. Born and trained in the Netherlands, Ben was instrumental in setting up a nationwide research consortium in women's health that produced many landmark studies. Ben went to Australia in 2014 and works as a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Monash University since 2018. He continues to develop extensive relations with Asian universities, whilst continuing to collaborate within European networks. Ben has mentored more than 120 PhD students and has published more than 1,500 papers, many in high-impact journals. This is outstanding. Good evening, Professor Ben Mall. It's really a great honor to have you with us here. And thank you so much for sharing your time and our knowledge with us tonight. Please feel free to share your screen and begin your presentation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Professor Schmidt, for that kind introduction. And hello from Melbourne. And before I start, I just want to confirm that you can see my slides and can hear me. Correct?
Perfect, perfect.
Good, okay. And yeah, this is an important topic that I have dedicated a lot of time to the last couple of years. And I also want to stress that this is work in progress and it's development and thinking and what you do. And I very much look forward to your feedback. And I will say that at the end also, but I think one of the reasons I'm here is that I had a very good interaction with André on particular cases. And actually, I think we showed that you can deal with this problem in a respectful way. So here are the disclosures, not relevant for the talk, I think. So I will share with you my own experience, then spend some time on data fabrication, governance, and discuss next steps. And I very much look forward also to your feedback. So if we talk about fraud in research, then we should realize that there is a whole spectrum of things that can go wrong. On one hand, there are just errors that inevitably happen, right? Wrong observations, wrong analysis. We try to prevent it. And on the worst side of things, there is illegal human experiments. And then in between, there is a whole spectrum. But data fabrication is actually quite bad and is just above illegal experiments. And I will address fabrication here. So I will not discuss sloppy research or things that can be done better, but are done based on honest data. Realize that there is a spectrum from non-intentional to intentional. There is a spectrum from error to fraud. And there is also a spectrum from difficult to detect to easy to detect, but maybe some of the fabrication is not that easy to detect. So why is this important?
Professor, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt you. I think
Yeah.
I could not see the next slide. I think you tried to change the slide, but I'm just seeing the first one. I don't know what happened. Perhaps you have to.
Yeah, which one do you see now? Second in
I
guidance,
see we have the evidence. No, just the first one. Like it's not in that format of full screen, you know. We observed that you talk about the disclosure, but
yeah. I'll try again.
Okay.
What do you see now?
I see the same page, the same.
You see a graph from type of misconduct or not?
No, just the first slide, and on one side you can see all the slides, you know. But not in the full screen. I don't know if you are using two different screens. Sometimes is the problems with two different screens when you connect the laptop with two different screens. I think it's the same. It's just, I don't know what's happening.
I'm just going to close the PowerPoint and stop sharing. I apologize for that.
No problem at all.
Opened again. I go to presentation. You see my startup slide in the full mode?
Yeah, now it's full mode. Perfect.
And it's moving?
Yeah, it's moving. Thank you so much.
That. So I've spoken about, when I spoke about wrong observation till fabrication, that was this slide. And then I went to confirm that you see evidence-based medicine now.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good. So the reason this is important is I am passionate about evidence-based medicine because I think it makes medicine better. And the foundation of evidence-based medicine actually comes from Guide and Sackett. This is Canada, McMaster University in the early 90s, where they introduced it at first as scientific medicine. And then their colleagues said, well, if you're doing scientific medicine, then our medicine is unscientific. So they changed it then to evidence-based medicine. But I've worked in that area and did a lot of trials myself. And at some stage, I was made aware that there was this trial, which is about polyps, to remove if you have a patient undergoing intrauterine insemination. And then there is this trial on myomas, also in infertile patients, also a randomized clinical trial. So if you look at the abstracts of both studies, then the first study from Spain has 215 patients. 93 get pregnant, 64 versus 29. And if you look into the Egyptian study, then you see exactly the same numbers. So it's 215, 93 pregnancies, 93 pregnancies, etc. And if you're not convinced, then you go to the baseline table of the Spanish study and the Egyptian study, then the mean gestational age of the patients is exactly the same, including the standard deviation. Realize that the sample size is different, and the distribution of polyps, myomas, is also exactly the same. So what's happening here is that the Spanish have done a perfectly okay study, I think, but the Egyptian colleague just takes the data from the other study and makes it with another disease, an article that was actually published in Fertility Sterility, which is a high impact journal in our field. So this was detected, not by me, I only saw the retraction. And it says that it's retracted because it duplicates, and this is one of the problems that we're going to discuss. There is much euphemism going on. I don't think this is duplication. That would be if you would do it from polyps to polyps, but this is data fabrication. So interestingly, this author has published 27 articles, and after this retraction, there is no system in place that assesses the other papers of that author in other journals. So everybody else is still unaware. Then I became more aware, and as an editor myself, I saw some problematic papers. I then flagged that with the authors. They went away, but I kept a copy, and then later I saw these papers published elsewhere, but the authors had changed the things where I put my fingers on. And because I got a copy of the original submission, we could then prove that there was fabrication. So there are two retracted papers. And then a student came to me from the Netherlands, Esme Bordewijk, and I don't know exactly how our conversation went. She was studying PCOS. I was triggered on studies from Egypt, because that's where I'd seen the previous problems from. And I said to her, well, maybe you should look carefully at your own review that you're doing. And after a couple of days, she came back and she says, well, I've looked at studies from Badawi and Abu Hashim, and the numbers in the tables have large similarities. So they're not exactly the same, but each green dot that you see actually returns in the other table, and each red dot returns but with 1 digit difference. But look, for example, at the lower side of the confidence interval, that is completely copied. And again, different interventions, different sample sizes, and different studies. So this is not the same study that is presented twice. And it happened more. Here is another example, and then we made a league table. So these are all the studies from Badawi, numbered 1 to 18. Green means a few similarities, can happen by chance, but red means so many similarities that you cannot explain that by chance, and that happened in the baseline tables, but also in the outcome tables. So that was really a wake-up call for me. And then this is obviously the problem. These papers are published, so these are the papers where Badawi publishes. And these papers are cited. So the way science works is we do science, we publish it, people assess it, and if they make guidelines, they use that information. So back to that author Shokir, because interestingly, Badawi and Abu Hashim, by coincidence, came from the same university as Shokir, where I started, so the guy from the myomas. And this is the number of papers, that RCTs, that Shokir has published. And then Esme put the title of his article in Google, and actually found that trick from polypstemiomas he had done that many times also in other articles, and we could detect about 7 or 8 articles. Strategies to detect fabrication. It's important to realize that if we look at papers, it's very difficult to prove it. So we can screen for problems, so to say, if we assess articles for publication as editors or reviewers, if we're doing meta-analysis. But the true proof comes from the individual data. And it's actually very difficult to fabricate data in such a way that you are not going to see the fabrication. So people have been working on checklists. This is from a paper in Nature 3 years ago now. Andrew Gray from Auckland, who discusses it and comes up with a checklist. This is a checklist that focuses specifically on randomized clinical trials, publishes this year. So here's an overview of things that you can check. You can look at previous retractions or expressions of concern, trial registration, sorry, it's important, ethics, the author group, how were the methods done, are the results plausible, etc. So here are all kinds of items that you can look at, and I've also been involved in making a checklist myself that's currently under review. I put a link to this checklist in the chat, so you can find that. But our checklist basically says if you see a paper, and we should start to do that actually as a routine, think about the governance. So if it's an RCT, was it registered? Was it registered on time? Does the registration data actually fit with the published data in terms of sample size, dates of start and ending? Look at the author group. I find articles with a very few number of authors for a very big trial actually suspicious. Plausibility of the intervention. Does it make sense clinically, what you see? Time frame. I work in obstetrics, gynecology. If you do an infertility study in people who try to get pregnant after IVF, but you report 3 months after the last recruit the number of babies born, yeah, that is not possible because that should take at least 9 months. So you can actually see whether the study was feasible, so to say. Dropout rates. Many problematic studies have exactly round numbers. There are even studies that have only even numbers throughout the whole paper. Baseline characteristics. If you have trials, then the baseline characteristics cannot be statistically significant, because then it was not randomized, but they can also not be too close together. And finally, outcomes and the treatment effect as compared to what's published in the literature. So others have used this checklist. This is the checklist that I just showed before. This is in a Cochrane review on ivermectin studies. So it's completely not my field. I've not been involved in this review, but you can see that from the 99 records that are, from the, from the 140 articles, there are about 40 that fail to pass the integrity check, so to say, or 30, so to say. So from 99 studies, for 30 the authors stay, we classified that as weighting as trustworthy, and we're going to do that as weighting classification. One important thing to do, and that's why the topic is so sensitive, is that detecting an article immediately goes to accusing people that they have fabricated. So if you talk about low quality of research, then you can have still a respectful conversation. But if you're going to accuse people, obviously, of fabrication, that's going to be a problem. A solution for that is actually to decide that you classify studies as awaiting classification, because then you don't have to say that you label them as problematic, but you still don't have to use it. So Cochrane is using this solution at the moment to allow them not to use studies that they think are problematic without labeling them immediately as fabricated. Another sensitive thing is that this comes from multiple, this comes from particular countries, which is obviously in modern day and age a very sensitive thing to label people based on their nationality or religion, etc., etc. But facts are that if you calculate, and this is in my field, obstetrics and gynecology, the number of RCTs in a country relative to the gross national product, so the income or the resources in a country available, then Egypt and Iran produce the most RCTs. Then there's a lot of studies from Europe, relatively, and the US and China do not contribute that much per GDP, but obviously because it's such countries, they still produce a lot. India the same. But realize that Egypt and Iran are high here. This is an overview of the retracted papers. You can have a look at the website Retraction Watch that reports on retracted papers, and in their website they document retracted papers. The biggest producers are China, Russia, Iran, Egypt, and then India, and to my surprise, Malaysia are quite high. I haven't seen that in my field, but because it's such a sensitive thing, and it says it's also or it has to do with the health of people. I think we should not close our eyes that this comes from some countries more than from other countries. So a couple of words on how to investigate the work of one author. So one of the other problems is that many of us only see a paper without the context of that author. But I actually have the habit, if there is a problematic article, to look also at the other work of that author. I showed you, and I have more examples of that authors actually copy tables from each other. You can see how many studies that author actually is doing at the same time. You can see in a trial registry how many RCTs this author has registered. There are studies where or authors where who have registered 60 or so RCTs that they have not published. And you can look at difference in baseline characteristics, which is also strange. If the BMI has a particular value, then that should be relatively stable between different studies. So this, again, other author, Al-Sharqi, is an example of data copying. This is an example of an author, Majed, that for very different gestational ages, duration of pregnancies, reports exactly the same birth rate, which is strange. And also you can see that in laboring women, in one study, his population is 33 years. In the other study, it is 25 years. Now, there can be, if this would be a population with women selected because they have 3 previous pregnancies or something. But if this is the same group, then it's very strange that you have such differences. The latest paper that this author has submitted reported on an average height of women of 1.73 meters, whereas in the country of Egypt, that is actually 1.60 meters. So unless he sampled the national volleyball team, that is also strange. Then, and I alluded on that, you can look at baseline characteristics. So baseline characteristics of RCTs by randomization should be relatively close to each other, but not too close. So if you find this is a distribution of p-values, and this is p.05, and this is 0.99 or 1, then this author, and that is Badawi, I already showed some of that work, has 50% of his p-values in the baseline tables 1 or close to 1. That is a problem also. You would expect these type of distributions. One author, make a table of what this author is doing. So this author actually, red means registration, blue is submission. So you think that this author already is doing research for a long time, but this is actually the moment that he starts to be active. And this picture, this is Dr. Rezek from Monash University, is even more interesting. So you think that this author is doing a lot of studies since 2012, but actually these are non-RCT, so they are not registered. He just produces one and submits them one after the other. Another remarkable thing is that from the top of my head, 70% of the RCTs of this author take exactly a year. So they go from December to December or from June to June, etc., which doesn't happen in practice also. Trial registration, very important. If you have a particular paper as an editor or reviewer, always type in the trial registration number in Google and make sure that you see what the author's planned. And it helps you in seeing what this author has done elsewhere. So this is an author where I had concerns about his published studies. But if I look into the trial registration, he had 25 other studies registered and completed, but not published. So a couple of examples with the use of the original data. This is a study that early got my attention. It's on sildenafil, so Viagra, to give it at pregnant women where there is oligoadrenalin, a low amount of amniotic fluid. And that study had a sample size of 200, I think. It recruited very fast. There are a couple of other things. I wrote a letter to the editor. If you complain or have concerns, you don't have to do that. You can also report anonymously. But I find it particularly useful to get your concerns out in the public domain. And then I asked for the original data, and I knew the editor, so he said, no, we can't share that. We have the data, but we think that they're okay. And there was an emailing, but at some stage the author said, well, actually, you can have the data. So this is the email from Maher on March 3rd. And then the editor said, well, here are the data. And then I was a bit nervous when I got the data because I thought, well, maybe I'm not going to find anything. But here is the data set. So perfectly organized, sorted in terms of babies with low pH and low EPCA scores. Could happen because you have sorted on that point. But then look at amniotic fluid index at randomization, 4.9, 4.8, 4.7, 4.6, 4.5, etc. That happens for many variables, actually. So this was proof that there was something wrong, and then it still took a long time for the paper to be retracted. That university now has said that data are not available for studies that are done more than 2 years ago. So one other problem is that in the process of investigation, we have to go to the universities where these people work. That is what the COPE, the overseeing body, recommends. But some of these universities are completely corrupt themselves. So this letter is actually signed by Professor Kandil, who I think is a fabricator himself. One other study where it took a long time for me to get the data, ridiculous number of women randomized, unfeasible. And then you could actually see, if you plotted birth weight against gestational age, that all babies born before 32 weeks were under 1,500 grams, and all babies over 1,500 grams were born after 36 weeks. This never happens. There always must be overlap. So that was an individual participant data meta-analysis. Others could have seen this too. That paper has now been retracted. So this was on how to detect. There are a lot of screening methods. I think the summary here is that you basically have to ask yourself, are the data true? That's something that many of us have never done, but you should, in my opinion, certainly as an editor or a reviewer, always ask yourself, was this study actually being done? And then with original data, you're pretty strong in finding out if it was fabricated or not. So how big is this problem? If you go to retracted papers, then that is actually an underestimation, because not many people flag problematic papers. And if you do it, the investigations go very, very slow. So looking at the number of retracted papers is not the way to go. This is a paper on data integrity. Another way of looking to that is looking at original data of submitted trials. John Carlisle from the journal Anesthesia is doing that. So the journal requires, or as a prerequisite says, the author should be willing to share the data. And when John assessed that, he found that the percentage of studies with false data varied between 20% and 90%. And completely fabricated data, Korea was quite good, but other countries like Egypt as high as 70%. So back to my own field, another way of assessing this is comparing conventional meta-analysis and Cochrane reviews to meta-analysis with original data. So this is a Cochrane review on progesterone to prevent preterm birth. These are the number of studies that are found. These are the reports of this study, 50% reduction. And this is the individual participant data meta-analysis. So what happened here is that only 31 out of 49, and these are relatively recent studies of the authors, shared the data, and the others didn't share them. So who did share? Europe, 9 out of 10. US, 14 out of 15. Brazil, 1 out of 2. South Asia, 2 out of 4. Australia was the best, 100%, 1 out of 1. But the problem again, Africa and the Middle East, who only shared a minority of their studies. And then if you redo the meta-analysis with the individual data, then the risk reduction is still there, but it's much lower. It's not a 50% reduction, but a 20% reduction. And I think that difference in estimate is due to false data. Endometrial injury is done as an add-on for women who are treated with IVF. We have assessed the quality of these data. So if we label them, this was a meta-analysis of 29 papers, then we think that 11 are trustworthy, 11 are high risk of problems. And that actually very much correlates with whether people share data. So the people who have trustworthy studies also share, but the people who have problematic studies do not share the data or do not even respond. Treatment of hemorrhage, the same problem. This is maternal mortality cause #1 in the world, also a terrible problem in Brazil. Hypertension, the same. And as said, these papers end up in meta-analysis. So on average, I think, based on what I showed you and some other data, is that 30% of the randomized clinical trials, at least in my field of ONG, are fabricated, and they end up in guidelines. So how do we deal with fabrication? That's a different story, actually. So this again is the Borderwijk review, so the 35 RCTs that we detected. Some papers were retracted. Some had an expression of concern, but a large amount of papers actually is untouched. And I think up until the day of today, about half of the problematic Badawi and Abu Hashim papers have not been retracted and do not have an expression of concern visible. And another fact is that if you ask journals to investigate, then within a year, only 25% of that investigation is completed. So a couple of examples to close off. This is studies on hypertension in pregnancy, which is maternal mortality cause #2 in the world after hemorrhage. 500 women in this study randomized by Dr. Salama for methyldopa, nifedipine, or no medication. So together with George Sade, I wrote a letter. I said, well, that's a very quick recruitment. Very unethical, actually, to have a no medication for a couple of other issues. And surprise, surprise, a year later, in not the same, but a related journal, so this was pregnancy and hypertension, this is hypertension in pregnancy, Rezik, who was the second author here and is the first author here, then published a similar trial with the only difference that the middle treatment was not nifedipine, but labetalol. And he claimed that it was done in the same hospital at the same time of his first trial. And if you don't believe it, the tables of these two papers read, actually, this is paper 1, this is paper 2. These tables are the mother, these are the baby, the neonate. So red means equal numbers. So he basically had, again, done data copying. And another remarkable thing, and it took me a while to find it out, was actually that all the data in this paper are even, which also doesn't happen, right? You don't have 30 or 32 observations where you all have even data. But nobody does anything, expression of concern only after a very long time. And then you can expect this. So here is the meta-analysis for antihypertensives in women with chronic hypertension, published. The problematic studies that I just showed are in there. So I compared that with Boeing, knowing that the software of their airplanes was wrong, and they still didn't say anything. So I wrote a letter to the editor and I said, are we using a Boeing 737 MAX? And the editor refused to publish that letter and left the meta-analysis untouched and says we're only going to change the meta-analysis if the original papers are going to be retracted. So if you don't believe it, this is the same author, Rezik, different studies. And look what he is doing. The 2027-3 is a 2973, the 164 is a 264, 35.22 is a 34.22, etc., etc. So this guy really, in my opinion, is fabricating everything. Other authors, this is from Dr. Kumar from India. Green buttons in the two groups of an RCT are exactly the same. And it's not so worried if it would be like age 21, or BMI 23. But if you look into the 2 digits behind the dot, then you don't expect that that is exactly the same. So I work a lot on it, sorry, and I speak out. But one of the concerns is that the buy-in from editors and publishers is actually very limited. People say, I really have no time for this. The journal gets 80 submissions a week. Don't worry, it happens everywhere. We cannot keep up with the number of complaints you send us. I said, well, that's because I cannot keep up with the number of problematic articles that you publish. We are working on it. Please be patient, etc., etc. And here you see time to decision from the journals. After 1 year, not even 25% of the cases have a decision. I had a lot of complaints about papers, my own papers myself. It's all investigated and cleared. I'm happy about that, but it was not pleasant, specifically not from collaborators. And that is because the people who are in trouble because I follow them actually have decided that if they take me down, then their problem is solved. This comes from respected colleagues in the field, a paper that is now retracted. Somebody wrote to me, you can't constantly lie and expect people to trust you. This is a paper from the Brazilian Journal of Anesthesiology. So I think the reason I'm here is that during my work, I found some problematic papers also in that journal. I wrote to André Schmidt at the time. We didn't know each other. And I must say that and he can comment on that also, that I think in a very respectful way for the authors, we did a good investigation. So what I feel of experience is that many journals where I go to, they actually never come back to me and take years to investigate themselves. But here, André investigated, assessed also. And in some cases, we came to the conclusion that there was no wrongdoing or no proof of wrongdoing. And in other cases, there was. And I think for each case, we could handle that in 3 months or so. And I actually don't understand why that is not able elsewhere, because it's so good to give that signal, so to say. So I close off. Fabrication, yes, it is there. Medicine is the Olympic Games without doping checks. It happens in areas where there is a lack of governance. Peer review does not detect fabricated studies, and the majority of the academic community is looking away. I think that the rate is 20 to as high as 30%. That might be different in other journals, but if I look at the work of John Carlisle, I actually don't think so. We are able to detect data fabrication, and the biggest challenges I think we have on the level of governance. And with that, I give back to Professor Schmidt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Really, really remarkable presentation. You presented to us very concerning data, and you really can see through your data what's the size of the problem. That's our main intention here, to provide to our readers and collaborators that it does exist. And there are some strategies, if you take it seriously, to detect and analyze. And of course, it was really remarkable. And I think your lecture is changing a paradigm here to our colleagues, and it was really great. I think we, in a few minutes, will start to receive some questions. Meanwhile, when we wait for the questions from the audience, I would like to give some to make a few questions about what you presented to us. One question is related to how to detect the fraud and the data fabrication. You, of course, told us how to analyze the tables, but you know it's difficult when you see the general picture of the article, when you go and you don't go deep in the results and tables, you see just the main results to detect it if you are not prepared to do that. For example, for journals, there are some artificial intelligence program softwares that can analyze the data, analyze the manuscript, and detect data fabrication, as we do for plagiarism, for example.
Well, that's developing, but it's not there yet, I would say. And I'm not that worried, because I think one is, if you're aware, then you'll see a lot of things, and you should basically ask yourself the question: could this study actually have been done, so to say? So if I show these studies of 500 women randomized in 3 groups in 2 years in one center, yeah, I mean, everybody who has done RCTs themselves know that it is not possible, so, or unlikely. So that is one thing. So and then the other thing is, do not be reluctant, certainly not at the process of submission, of asking original data and ethics documents, right? So your original screening is not a question like, I have to decide whether it's right or wrong. But if you're uncomfortable with it, just write in the rebuttal, maybe with other questions that you have to the authors, please send me the original data. And that is developing. I'm working with a group in Sydney that has now made an algorithm, and they're translating that into software that potentially in an hour time can run through an original data set. So I think that's good. That's gonna help a lot. And we have done that also together. You have sent me a couple of data sets. I'm not going to disclose who it was, but yeah, we found the problems also, right? So I think that is, and I think that will, if we do that, that will prevent things. I think I spoke to Kurt Barnard, who is a colleague with fertility sterility, who told me, Ben, we are not seeing these problematic submissions anymore. So you save yourself actually a lot of work by being strict also, because the people who really want to fool you, so to say, they go elsewhere. So there are many arguments to say why you should invest in that and also be clear and transparent.
Perfect, Professor. In fact, when we receive some manuscripts, when the results are too good to be true, or the number of patients are incredible high, it's something that make us to pay more attention on that findings.
Yeah.
Do you think, for example, when you receive a suspicious manuscript, but it's a very interesting result, very interesting find that you can change any practice, you should, before going further with the review, you should ask to authors to share their original data sets before the analysis of the.
I think so, but a couple of things. I would already make in the conditions for publication from the journal the statement that at any time you can ask the data. So one of the problems there is currently is that has never been formulated or documented. So authors say, well, we have passed peer review 2 years ago, we're not going to discuss it anymore. And there's actually no legal ground then for the journal to come back on that because it passed peer review. So if you discuss with your publisher that you want in your conditions for acceptance of a paper that the author should at any time be, of course, within reasonable time, to be able to share the data, you already solve it. It's one sentence, you solve an important problem. And then if you are stuck with time, I would focus on RCTs. They are the most important in terms of influencing clinical practice. That is what going into Cochrane and going into guidelines. So I'm worried about other research also, but if you fabricate some mechanistic research or basic research, there is still a process to follow before that is translated into clinical practice. And realize that for the fabricators, RCTs are attractive because they score high, and if you fabricate it doesn't cost anything. Whereas for people who do honest research, RCTs are difficult because they're so expensive, right? So each of us can do 10 observational studies, retrospective studies with the students that walk in, etc., etc. But if you want to do an RCT, or if I want to do an RCT, then you need a network, grant money. So the number of RCTs that you produce will be much lower than RCTs that than your observational studies. But for a fabricator, that doesn't count, because fabrication doesn't cost anything. So you better produce an RCT. That's my explanation why we see so many more fabricated RCTs as compared to the rest of the research. My estimate is that 2% of the research is fabricated, overall medical research,
wow.
but 30% of the RCTs.
Wow.
For the reasons that
That's a large number. Yeah, that's a large number. If you analyze, for example, there are some manuscripts indicating, for example, the bias of publication, for example, negative versus positive results, the difficulty that we have as authors to publish our negative results. You already have this bias of publication. Imagine when you insert this question.
But the fabricated RCTs are also more often positive, and the reason is that the authors know that sells better, right? You're not going to fabricate something that subsequently is difficult to sell. You make it as attractive as possible.
Yeah, and that's my next question to you, in fact. This conflict of interest that we have as scientists, probably all around the world, you receive more grants when you have more publications, when you have better clinical trials performed, usually when you are a more important scientist, And here in Brazil, for example, to receive grants, it's very difficult to receive grants, and you have to publish more. And of course, there is this conflict of interest that is quite difficult to manage, especially for scientists that just do science, And if you are not completely honest, perhaps you will go to the wrong way, and you're going to start to produce this false data and manipulate your data to have positive results, and of course publish more. How is there any thing that you, for example, think as more like philosophical way of thinking, for changing the way that we do science nowadays in terms of the relation grants and positive trials?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but we should obviously value research in a different way, much more to the importance and much less in terms of whether you're first or last author, what the impact is, where it is published, etc. I mean, there are all kind of wrong incentives in the system, although I don't think that in our systems they lead to fabrication. In our systems they lead to sloppy or not relevant research, so to say. And another thing to realize is that these people do this also because they have to face unfeasible and irrational and unreasonable requirements to make promotion. So if the system is going to require the impossible for you, that is obviously an incentive to do that. So that should stop also. Every student in Egypt has to publish a master thesis, which is an independent piece of research. I don't think that every medical student should have to do that, right? But if you're going to require that, you're going to get the number of students times times one is the number of potential papers that you get. So there's a lot, I think, that we can change in terms of detection, but also in terms of other more reasonable intentions that can help us to solve this problem.
Perfect, Professor. And how can we find these authors that are involved in retractions? For example, there are famous cases. We unfortunately in anesthesia we have several examples that are famous, and But for example, as an editor, sometimes I receive a trial for an author that I have. Of course, I don't know him, and I have to check where do you think that I can check the background of these authors to see for retractions?
Retraction Watch. So
Perfect.
Retraction Watch is a database where all the problematic or the retracted RCTs are bundled. And they have a database, and you can put the name of the author that you see in the database. And I mean, let's face it also, our fields are not that bad, that big also, right? I mean, at some stage, you know, for obstetrics gynecology or for anesthesiology, who is where in the world. Maybe with the exemption of China, that is really big. And I must admit, with my European background, that I have difficulty distinguishing all the Chinese names. But for other countries, I know, and let's also face it. I mean, Brazil, a wonderful country, but not one of the richest countries in the world, just as South America. But it's not happening there. So it's not necessarily one-on-one related that if you have low resources, that you are going to fabricate, right? I mean, a country of Brazil, I was really impressed here with I worked with Rodolfo Pacaniela. I worked with Ricardo in your center. And I'm really impressed with how people work and how dedicated they are, etc., with relatively limited resources. So you basically prove that it's all possible to do it the right way also, so to say. And that counts for Brazil, but for me it counts for the whole South America. I don't see these problems in any of the countries in South America.
Perfect. Thank you. And I think I have an additional question about the trial registration. You talk about the importance of trial registration. For example, recently in our journal, in the beginning of this year, we started to ask the obligation for a prospective registration of the trial. And unfortunately, when I did some research about it, I observed that there are several important and high impact journals that still don't ask for this prospective registration in an official database. Don't you think that is really important to change, especially for high impact journals?
It should. I mean, it's if you don't know by now that you should register a trial, then yeah, where are you, so to say? I mean, I must admit that if you do a study and you do that with students, and I do that a lot, and the student is always new and has to learn. So you could also, if the trial registration is not perfect, ask for ethics documentation. But again, these are situations where you can ask for the original data and get an impression about the quality of the rest of the world, rest of the work, so to say. But in general, I would say the rule would be no or late trial registration, no publication.
Perfect, Professor. Really, I didn't receive any other question here. I don't know if you want to add any comment about your presentation before the closure.
Thanks for the time, and bon noche, and I hope to be back in Brazil in November, so maybe we can have a meeting then.
Wow, very good, very good news.
And another thing is, if there are editors among the audience now, don't hesitate to reach out. I put my name in the chat. Happy to have also, and I think with André, to the others, with André Schmidt, you have an excellent leader also in your country who is able to put this on the agenda.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. It was really a remarkable presentation and an amazing, outstanding opportunity to discuss this topic. We have here with us our president of the Brazilian Society of Anesthesiology, the Professor Maria Angela Tardelli. I don't know if Professor, you want to talk a few words to us.
Just to thank you to Dr. Ben to accept our invitation, and we are waiting for you in November.
Okay. Well, I look forward to that. We stay in touch.
Perfect, Professor. Thank you so much for the attention of the audience, and see you next month in our next webinar late April. Thank you so much for your attention, and have a good night and a good day in Australia.
Yes.
No worries. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.